Mother, man.
G'day guys, this is Mick. Time to break out some straight razors on Murder Metal Mayhem.
Spreading faster than a case of the clap in a trailer court. Able to shatter eardrums within a 666-mile radius. A podcast more brutal than all the rest. It's Murder Metal Mayhem! This is Pete Altieri with the Murder Metal Mayhem podcast, and I have the privilege of doing this interview with Mick, our friend, listener, 666 Club member, and former Australian police officer. We've had you on at least once before. It's always fun. And how is it tomorrow in Australia, Mick?
Mate, tomorrow is good.
At
least tomorrow is good. At least in my neck of the woods, anyway.
I checked the weather over there. I'm a little jealous because it looked pretty sweet.
Yeah, it's sitting around 26 Celsius where I live now, which is about 1,000 miles north of where I was before. I'm now by the ocean. Sitting. I think it's like 79 Fahrenheit sort of degrees.
Yes,
the only thing
that is what it was.
Yeah, the only thing I have to worry about is crocodiles, mate. So
oh boy.
we'll just make sure we steer clear of them when we see them.
That would be a good thing. That would be a good thing. Now, as you know, we've done some more high profile Australian cases. We've done Catherine Knight, Ivan Milat, Snowtown murders, David Burney, Bryant Park, and some others. And we're going to be going now to the 1920s and some total craziness going on in the underworld. And I thought it would be good, obviously, with your background and where you're living, to kind of paint a picture for our listeners of that time and kind of what was going on to kind of set the stage here.
Yeah, certainly. As I said before, it's very similar to the 1920s sort of era, that prohibition sort of period post-World War One, that you also experienced in the States. So, World War One hadn't not long finished, a lot of soldiers returning, commencement at the end of that, of the 20s towards the Great Depression and unemployment, and in particular at Australia at that point, we had a lot of, post-war immigration. And as a result of that, there was a few changes that took place. Some of the things, we'll discuss, but basic sort of things like there was the outlawing of cocaine. It was interesting to know that it was, readily available at dentists and chemists and doctors and stuff. And that obviously pushed the access of it to, organised gangs and underworld. They had the early shutting of pubs and clubs, which meant, the sly grog or, bootlegged alcohol, became more of an issue and a huge revenue, era. Things like the outlawing of, pistols and handguns, which resulted from, this war to deal with cocaine and alcohol. The New South Wales government basically said you can't have a firearm without a license or a pistol. So obviously what that's resulted in is people turning to alternative,
black
weapons
market.
Black market and, an alternative, weapons, which tended to be the straight razor or cutthroat razor.
Right. Yeah, we're going to get into some cutthroat razoring tonight. That is, wow, that's brutal. Definitely would not want to be on the receiving end of straight razor, that's for sure.
No, and what was interesting, a bit of a loophole, was that vagrancy laws that prohibited men from earning a living from prostitution, but didn't result to the sale, didn't, relate to women. So hence, we're going to talk about Tilly Devine and Kate Leigh, where, their partners, or their husbands couldn't benefit from prostitution, but as a madam, they could run it and earn a living.
Right. Yeah,
which is bizarre.
That is a pretty major loophole for sure. Yeah, I found that fascinating that was a thing. Now, I'm not sure if it's just me, but I seem to hear the word Melbourne brought up an awful lot in this stuff. And what is it about that city that makes it appear to at least be a hub for a lot of this activity?
Yeah, look, I think people who live outside of Melbourne might debate that because there's a they probably don't want to be touted as the gang capital of Australia,
Well, I'm
but
sure.
certainly in the in the older era, it played a huge part, and a lot of that, as we discussed in the last time I spoke, was about especially Italian immigrants, coming over. The organised crime started to filter in. A lot of those earlier issues in and around the Melbourne gang wars all resulted, from former Italian mafia type style gangs. So
Right.
that tended to be, because that was a huge area where a lot of Italians, and Eastern Europeans had immigrated to. So they
Okay.
obviously brought that culture, late 1800s, early 1900s. It was a poor country still. So you had to do what you needed to do. So, but even now, there's probably a lot of cities that have taken over Melbourne as far as reported gangland crimes. Sydney is huge now for especially the Middle Eastern,
Oh, wow.
bunch of guys.
Yeah.
They play a huge role. Most of our outlaw motorcycle gangs now are full of Polynesians. So people from the Polynesian Pacific Islands, New Zealanders, Samoans, Solomon
Interesting.
Islands. So we've got those sort of aspects, and as well, the dispossessed people who've come over from Africa, have also started to look at African gangs.
Wow.
So definitely back in the day, Melbourne was it.
Now, where's
all of the
Melbourne in relation to the water? Because I was wondering if that could be it too, with ships
Right on the
coming
water.
in with product being able to get. It's right on the water.
Right on the water, yeah.
Okay.
So it's in the southern part of Australia, so down the southern, I suppose, border. So yeah, there's major harbours. That's where, as I said, a lot of shipping came in.
Sure.
And yeah, back in the day, it certainly was the thing. Some of the people we spoke about last time, Chopper Reed and
Right.
all those guys, they're all the Carlton crew. They're all very much Melbourne orientated.
That's interesting. Chopper Reed, I watched this channel on YouTube called The Behavior Panel, and they
Yep.
break down the body language for all sorts of different people. And they
Yep.
did the last Chopper Reed interview. They analyzed his body language. I haven't watched it yet, but I'm definitely going to. And when I saw it, I thought about our conversation because I didn't realize he was gone. And I said I
Yeah,
was going to invite him over to your house the next time we had you on. So
yeah.
So
I would
you
have. I would have had to pay it a bit to fly him up here.
oh my gosh, yeah, what
Well, he
a
would-
character.
He would certainly be one to to do something on, because he was just an absolute larrikin.
Oh yes, definitely, definitely. Now this was a time we've been talking about the razor gangs, and it was in response to, like you were saying, where they cracked down on the specific thing was the Pistol Licensing Act of 1927. So that was in retaliation of cracking down on cocaine, you said?
Yeah, part of it was that once cocaine and then alcohol became very much in the hands of of local gangs. There was a few incidences where some warring factions essentially were using firearms or pistols and shooting each other. So the New South Wales government did a bit of a crackdown, and said you can't have a pistol or a handgun unless you're licensed, and impose some pretty severe penalties, at that point in time.
Right.
So you're looking at 1920. So I had a bit of a look at what the penalties were. So they range anything from, in those days, 50 to £100 fine or 6 months in prison. And given that, in the 1920s, the average wage of someone was only £200 a year,
Right.
half your yearly wage is gone.
Right.
Just for possessing a handgun. So
Sure.
as a result, they needed to turn to something else, and straight razors were it.
Yeah, definitely very, very intense. But I found that interesting. Now, our feature the week that we're going to use this interview, as we've mentioned, the real life character known as Tilly Devine, and her husband, Big Jim, were definitely quite the pair. And what was their relationship like, and how dysfunctional was it? Because I think they were like a reality show. If there was one back then, might have been them,
Yeah, maybe they're the 1920s version of the Osbournes or something.
Right.
But yeah, look, by all accounts, incredibly turbulent relationship from the start. As we delve into it, she was a young prostitute or young girl living in England.
Right.
And at the time, a bunch of Australian soldiers, were over there for the war or World War One. And she happened to take a liking to, or hooked up with it. As you said, Jim Devine, who was an Australian soldier. He's, tended to, string her a story about,
right,
the property and the land and how successful he was back in Australia.
She got there. And she's like, "What the hell is this?" And then she's got a prostitute again too. So
exactly.
She thought she was done with all that, but not so much.
No, so she's gone from working class London to working class Sydney.
Right,
and same sort of demographic. Blue collar working class Docklands. Quite poor sort of areas.
Right.
in the middle of Sydney at the time, and he's essentially started to pimp her out. And as the business grew, especially with her being able to establish prostitution,
right?
He was the enforcer, but tended to be something like 30 years or however long they were together of domestic violence. He was brutal towards her.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Now, Tilly was known as Razor. I think there's a book about her called Razor. And I love this one. The Queen of the Woolloomooloo was another one of her names. And that has got to be one of my favorite names of a town or city. The way it's spelled with all the O's in it is really over the top. But I love those Australian slang words and town names. So yeah. Look, it's an Aboriginal word, so there's some debate of what it means. It can mean, anything from, small black kangaroo to, to battleground or, land of blood. So it depends on who you talk to, because obviously no one's around to be able to, articulate it properly. But right.
Yeah, look, I think, the razor has obviously come from, her fondness, and her gang's fondness of using the weapon. There's multiple stories of, her using it herself on people. Yeah. Especially, rivals who have wronged her in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as the Queen of Woolloomooloo, it's a suburb, in the middle of Sydney.
Okay, I was wondering where it was. Okay.
Yeah, so it's not far from the Docklands and Sydney Harbour. There's a few other sort of famous places here called King's Cross and Surrey Hills, and they're that old Docklands, working class sort of area. So, her establishments were set up in that Woolloomooloo, Darlinghurst area.
Okay.
So hence, and that's where, that name come from.
Yeah, I love the interest. A lot of the Canadian towns have really interesting names like that, and I'm guessing it's probably the same thing here in the U.S. as well with the, Native Americans and the indigenous people up in Canada. Probably that's where all these names come from. I just find it interesting. Now,
yeah, look, I was interested that obviously being an avid listener, you've dropped off in doing the funny town names in the last few weeks and stuff.
Well, we had a run where we all took a turn, and then somehow it got off of that. But yeah, I really like those because it's like endless. I mean, I don't think we could ever do them all. There's so many of them. So. Now, she was involved in all sorts of illegal activities. You mentioned brothels, and then you also mentioned sly grog. And what exactly is that?
Yeah, well, as you know, it's an Australian slang term, so it's essentially outlawed or bootlegged alcohol.
Oh, okay.
So sly, is self-explanatory. So it's, covert, I suppose, and grog is is an Australian term originally used for, back in the colonial days, it was a watered down version of rum. So it was a mixture of rum and water.
Okay.
But now it basically is just a common term used by, 90% of Australia to talk about alcohol. So if you're getting grog, you're basically going to go and buy alcohol. Liquor stores are commonly referred to as grog shops.
Interesting. Okay.
So essentially, it's, as I said, those sly grog areas and those places are very similar to what your speakeasies were.
Right, right. That makes sense. That makes sense. Now, like with most of the gangland violence, these figures like Tilly Devine had rivals, and you mentioned her earlier, Kate Leigh. What was her story? I mean, with how she got into that business.
Yeah, well, she's someone who is quite well known in the Sydney area, even though, Tilly Devine, most people have heard of her. Kate Leigh was not just seen as, as a crook. She was, an entrepreneur. She was someone who did wonderful things for the community. She was really held in high esteem.
Interesting.
Whereas Tilly was just seen as, lower class. You're just a brothel owner.
Gotcha.
And I think in later life, she tried to make amends, by trying to emulate, or try to get that popularity that Kate had actually had. But Kate comes from a small rural town called Dubbo, which is in the central sort of area of New South Wales. She had a pretty rough life by all intents and purposes. Not the greatest upbringing. And at some point, made the move, from a rural town, into Sydney. Saw that, there was an opportunity, especially in relation to when, cocaine was outlawed and, alcohol became something that you couldn't purchase after 6 o'clock.
Right.
So she started, looking at, things like, the sly grog and cocaine dealing, illegal gambling, but also ran some brothels herself. And she was also located in that central Docklands sort of area of Sydney, and actually not far from where, Tilly's business operated.
Okay, so that makes sense. They'd be kind of, trying to turf war type crap,
Absolutely. So, Woolloomooloo and Surrey Hills, which is where they both respectively resided, back onto each other.
Oh, okay.
So it was basically a means of defending, their business turf.
Right.
The rivalry lasted something like, I think, the best part of 20 years.
Wow.
Until the New South Wales, police brokered a deal, got them together and said, there needs to be a bit of a ceasefire here, guys.
Right.
But, according to, to some sources, that you look at, they'd actually made up in later life, and probably after, they both lost everything.
Right.
They had nothing to fight over,
True.
Tilly was at Kate's funeral, for example, but she had quite a large funeral, 600-700 people, including, police commissioners and all sorts of, famous people, whereas Tilly had probably, the best part of a handful.
Interesting. Yeah, that's it's just interesting the way those two were doing the same thing, but one was perceived so much differently than the other.
And maybe due to Kate being 20 years older.
Oh, that's true.
She was more established. She'd probably been, in the area, and had that time to, not just do the illicit side of things, but, garnish favour with, local politicians. And she was very provided, money to charities and support.
That's how Capone was. I mean, they loved him.
Absolutely.
Because he took care of people and throwing money around, and people loved him,
Pablo Escobar the same, ran for,
True.
What was he, local member of parliament or something?
He was, yeah, that's crazy.
Just garnishing favour with all those people, providing, support to returning servicemen, So she was really seen as being, a pillar of the community.
Yeah.
Whereas in later life, when Tilly came along, she was just seen as someone who's taken advantage of a bad situation.
Right, right. Now, I read that Tilly was married a second time after Big Jim left to a retired military man, Eric John Parsons, and that there's a story she shot him in the leg right before they got married. I mean, what was up with that? I didn't really dig into the details, but sounds kind of like, why would you continue to marry somebody that just shot you in the leg?
Sounds very Catherine Knightish, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Poor old John Price.
Right.
Again, surely they would know, what they're getting themselves into.
Oh my gosh!
But maybe it's that she was famous and had the money and had a lot of influence around town. He was a former soldier or former serviceman.
Right.
Probably wasn't a lot of options for him. But if he could, in some way get involved in what she was doing,
right,
he'd be a kept man, so to speak.
Right.
But apparently he shot him after a drunken argument, and there was some suggestion that their relationship, was plagued with domestic violence as well. But
wow.
I think it didn't go anywhere because he obviously failed to testify against her in the court matter. So he's just gone, nothing happened, and
right.
The charge went away.
Interesting. I read that. I was like, what? I didn't see that in the documentary, but I was reading about her and I stumbled on that. I was like, holy shit.
Well, fancy being the person who flipped on her, and then sent her to jail. I'm sure, all of her crew would be hunting you for the rest of your life.
Right. Exactly. Now, there are some great Australian personalities that make up that gangland culture. We talked about some of them last time you were on, but, George Freeman, Chow Hayes, and then Alphonse Gangitano. We could do episodes on any one of those, but any others that you'd like to mention? Because there's so many of them, some great nicknames too.
Well, where do you start? So... there's one, obviously, a guy called Squizzy Taylor. He was a Melbourne gangster in the 20s, and he was the real start of, what people perceived as being, a gangster, in that time. So he was a huge influence, in and around Melbourne. As you mentioned, Chow Hayes is essentially referred to as Australia's first gangster.
Right, right.
He modelled himself very much on, the American gangsters of the time. I think, as we discussed in the last episode, doing anything with Mr. Rentakill would be, an interesting matter, and Chopper.
Yes.
Good old Mark Brandon Reed.
Yeah, definitely. Chopper's got to be one we do. And then, we've referred to him a couple different times. We've done some of the Australian episodes. We were talking about Roger Rogerson. I think his name came up. So another classic we've already done. But from the other side of the house, a cop gone bad with that story. So
yeah, Chopper is a very enigmatic character in Australia. Everyone knows Uncle Chop Chop, as he used to call himself. Eric Bana did that movie, so if you want to get a bit of a snapshot of his life, Eric Bana, the Australian actor, played, a movie called Chopper.
Oh, okay.
And and Chopper had a bit of an involvement. He's the one who actually chose Eric Bana as the actor.
Wow, okay.
Because they came from the same sort of area in Melbourne, and he's big, intimidating, sort of a guy. Even though he was a comedian to start with, but he does a really good version, And if you watch the movie, there's some poetic license in it, but it's pretty straight on for what had occurred.
Interesting. Yeah, I definitely want to watch that because every Australian documentary I watch, he's on there. And the shit that he comes out with is like, wow, just completely no filter, just letting it fly, and it's
Zero
hilarious.
fucks given.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's too bad he's gone, because he would have been a great guest on Murder Metal Mayhem. That's for sure.
Oh, mate, he would have loved it.
Yeah, he would have loved it. That's for sure. So now, what is it about the gangsters, do you think, Mick, that tends to interest the public? I mean, true crime fans, obviously, the characters in the U.S. like Capone and Dillinger, and we're going to be doing Babyface Nelson here coming up. But do you think, what is it about? Is that romanticized, or what is it about that gangland world that seems to fascinate people?
Yeah, look, I think you're right. It is that very much romanticized, process. Everyone likes the outsider, even, the Robin Hood, the
Bonnie and
character.
Clyde,
Bonnie and Clyde, but even the old, fairy tales and stories that, we're told as kids.
Right.
Robin Hood is a very good example, rob
Yes.
from the rich to give to the poor. And,
Mm-hmm.
So it is very much that. And I think and this is a very good example, we tend to find, interest in, aberrant or antisocial behavior. We want to know why people do what they do.
Right.
And, most of them, had a lot of publicity. They perceived to being, living the life that they wanted to. They're outside the law, So it was very much that same era to start with. As I said earlier, that post-World War II, some of our guys, back in the day tried to model themselves on US characters. Chow Haynes, as I said, he really liked that early 1920s, American gangster.
Right.
Gangitano, the Black Prince of Logon Street, he used to do nothing but watch, Al Capone and Godfather movies, because he really saw himself as that.
Right.
That remnant of Italian organized crime in Australia. So I think you're right. It's something that's different. It's very much romanticized. And people tend to look at it going, if you're a mainstream white collar or blue collar worker, and you toe the party line and you live by the laws, there's that. I think not so much enviousness of those people who just do whatever they want and they act the way they want, and they go fuck you to the society, and
right.
There's probably a part of all of us that says, God, I wish I could do that.
Right.
I'd either have no job or I'd be in jail.
And I'm 100% Italian, a quarter Sicilian. And I watch, The Sopranos and Goodfellas and stuff, and I find a lot of it funny because it's so over the top and ridiculous. And I don't take offense to it. I do know there's a very small, I don't know personally anybody, but I've heard of people that get upset about that portrayal, because I don't think you could name a character in any TV show or movie that's Italian that's portrayed as not as a criminal or some sort of buffoon, dummy idiot. I don't take offense to it because I know obviously not all Italians are like that. But, this Jersey Shore and all this nonsense. I mean, people just assume that that's what it's about. And I think that's not how I look at it. I find I watch Goodfellas, and half of it I'm laughing my ass off because these characters are so over the top and almost bordering on absurd, but that's just...
And maybe that's done, I suppose, for purpose, is to try to take, a lighthearted approach to it. Because I don't know, maybe, the people who put them together think, well, we can't portray the seriousness of, Italian organized crime because, heaven forbid, people might be attracted or drawn to that life.
Sure.
Yeah, whereas
you got somebody hacksawing a body up in the bathtub and putting it in garbage bags. That's some pretty heavy stuff. So maybe, the kind of the sweet with the bitter kind of thing,
Swing to the opposite, and I think the Irish were very similar.
Yes.
In New York and that sort of area.
Brutal. Yeah. Oh yeah. Boston, we did the Whitey Bulger episode talking a lot about the Irish gangs, definitely fierce, that's for sure.
So when you were growing up, did you see much of it? Was it around?
I left. I grew up in the Bronx until I was 6, so I was
Okay.
very young. I had just started kindergarten.
Hmm.
We moved halfway in the middle of the year, moved to Connecticut, and so I grew up in a town of, maybe 30,000, about an hour and a half from 2 hours max to New York City. My dad worked in New York, but so I knew of it as I got into my teen years. Ironically, my little league, one of my little league baseball coaches was a former NYPD officer, and we were talking, and obviously, him and my dad hit it off. But then, he would always invite, because he had a son on the team as well, and he would always invite us to come to cookouts and stuff. And my dad would always come up with some sort of reason why he didn't want to go over there. And then one day the guy showed up with this younger man with him, and he said that this guy's an actor and he's going to play me in a movie. And we're like, what? And he's like, yeah, they wrote a book about me. It's called Prince of the City, and they're going to make a movie about it. And this is Treat Williams, the actor. And at that time, he had never done anything yet. I think that was his first movie. But he hung around with him for a couple months to get his mannerisms and speech and stuff, and then did the movie. But then I wanted to watch the movie, and my dad's like, no way. And then when I was, I think, 17, he sat me down and he's like, I didn't want you to see this because I didn't want you to get a negative impression on him, but he was a dirty cop, and he turned in all his buddies, wore a wire, and friends of his killed themselves over it. I mean, it was awful. He was a complete piece of shit. And he was writing books under his real name and going on these speaking tours. And my dad's like, I didn't want to go over to his house because I didn't want to be there when somebody showed up to take care of business, because he was using his real name, Bob Lucci. He's passed now, but it was crazy. But yeah, Prince of the Cities from the 80s, they did it. But yeah, he was my little league coach. So yeah, I knew of it. I knew about it, but my dad and mom were pretty good at kind of keeping that distance. I know my grandfather talked about that he was approached a lot as a young man to join the mob because of the Sicilian, my dad's side of the family, half Sicilian. So, he had that Sicilian in him as well. And they were looking for that, but he didn't want to do it. And he always stayed away from it. And so, I knew of it, but fortunately, nothing much more than that. So it wasn't until later on as an adult watching those type of shows and saw holy shit, wow, that's pretty crazy. I was pretty insulated from it.
Yeah, so they kept you at arm's length, I
They
suppose.
did. Yeah. So that was good. But yeah, Prince of the City, I couldn't believe it. My little league coach. So it's
Well,
pretty
well,
wild. Yeah. Pretty wild. So what is it you think that, why we don't hear about gangsters like this, kind of these bigger than life characters, almost seem like scripted, they're so over the top. Is it just changed? I mean, currently, obviously there's still gangs, but what is it about that type of character that we don't see that anymore?
Yeah, I think the day of the gangster's gone. There's a few who try to keep it going, but I think in general the revenue isn't there. The relationships with those industries and businesses that generated that sort of money is no longer there.
Right.
Even though to say that the crime is not there, and it's probably more covert than anything else. Like drug trade is still the second largest business in the world behind illegal firearms or illegal arms trade. So it's still huge, but obviously we don't have that out in the open. Everyone sees them because of the fact that the laws are too strict now. There's better ability to track people down.
Right.
Back in the 1920s and 30s, it would be the same, in the States or anywhere else. If you've got someone running a riot in Melbourne, there's no television. It's only either word of mouth or, a newspaper that takes 2 or 3 days to get to the next city.
Right.
That you're like, well, okay, yep, something's happening with gangland issues in Melbourne. Nowadays, someone does something obviously in Melbourne, 5 minutes later, in Brisbane, we hear about it. So the ability to track people down, is one of the issues. They're going to get caught very, very simplistically and very easily, and, those traditional types of, speakeasy, illegal alcohol, those types of things, it just simply, the revenue is just not there in that capacity anymore.
Sure.
I know in the past, there's been some sort of like talk or discussion about, organised crime, especially in New York, being involved in, construction companies and unions.
Yes.
And, that you just don't see that now. There's too many regulations and rules and laws and, around it. Tax fraud, you look sideways and the tax man's going to come get you. Right. Whereas back then, it probably took them, 7, 8, 9 years to find you, to then have a conversation about, tax laws.
Yeah.
So,
I'm reading the book Wise Guys. That's what they used for Goodfellas. And the credit card fraud I find interesting because the crap they were doing, you could never do today. Like you were just saying, as instantly as the information is exchanged. I mean, you couldn't do what they were doing with those credit card slips. You used to have to, they had all kinds of elaborate schemes, and it was pretty amazing what they did. A lot of these guys were barely, high school educated, but they were really smart when it came to crime. And I just found that fascinating because I thought there's no way in hell you could do this today,
No, not at all, So,
not for long, at least.
No, like credit card skimming is still, an issue. The Eastern Europeans, the Romanians and the, Albanians used to be huge with, skimming people's cards when you went to an ATM, to get money out.
Right.
And when you go to, especially if you're an Australian, you go to, some, Southeast Asian countries, on a holiday like Bali or Thailand or those types of places.
Right.
People they've got mobile scanners, so they can walk past you, press a button and it automatically grabs your credit card details.
Yeah. I got this thing in my wallet that's supposed to prevent that. I don't know if it will, but it's supposed to be anti-RF or whatever they call that.
RFT, yeah. It's like a Faraday bag, type situation. And, so that still happens, but obviously it's a lot more difficult, than it was just, as you said, doing the credit card slips or, the old mate from Catch Me If You Can, who was just, altering their paycheck, and the name on paychecks and stuff. So all of that's, it's been beneficial that you just don't get that type of thing anymore. But it's not to say that, we don't have, criminals with silly monikers or silly catch names still. We're still getting them.
Right.
We've got one in Australia, from a few years ago who was dubbed the postcard bandit. And there was some thought that he'd send photos, he'd rob a bank, and then he'd go to a different state and he'd send postcards to the police, etc.
Interesting.
So there's you still get those silly names that the journalists put on people, but certainly not to the same extent.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I always love the nicknames. It's just funny. Now, what sort of training do police officers that are handling these kind of vice crimes, the organized crime, what kind of training are they going through today that would, combat that sort of thing?
Well, obviously, I can only speak for Australia. I don't know what anyone else does externally, but in the college, if you're going through your police training, very little, if anything. It might be touched on. They might talk about, basic drug offences, but they're certainly not going to delve into, any of these vice crimes in any, sense of purpose, unless, you've come across a matter where you're investigating it, and you might go and spend some time with, a gang task force, or if you actually go to, that particular task force as a job. Prostitution, for example, it's not an issue in Australia anymore. It's not illegal. Most states have got a prostitution licensing act. You can work out of a brothel if you got a private escort, so you can work out of your own home in a hotel. If you're an individual sex worker, as long as you're registered and you're licensed, you can do it. You're not going to get the walking down the street, and the red light districts and those types of things. So they all tend to be licensed. Each state or territory, has an organised crime, or team that's specifically dealing with, gangs or gangland related issues. But that tends to be pushed now more towards, outlaw motorcycle gangs. All those smaller gangs, as opposed to the big end of town, like the really major organised crime.
Right.
When I was younger, in a completely different role, I did some work with the Queensland Police. And one of the areas, that I was working in is, a Chinatown in Sydney.
Okay.
And I was with the Chinese liaison, officer, and he would laugh because us Westerners had no idea about the level of organised crime that was occurring right under our noses.
Wow.
And as an example, he said, when you in that particular area, when you went to a Chinese store and outside it had the characters, in Chinese, but down in the bottom corner would have a little Chinese symbol. Okay. And he would say that symbol represents the gang that looks after this particular shop.
Wow.
So there was, that whole, protection racket, side of things. And it was massive, but we had no idea. So, as a bunch of, Caucasian white men, we had no clue of the exact, extent of, organised crime, that was taking place and supported organised crime. It wasn't just, we're being lorded over. It was, this is expected. You have to pay protection money, and, it's an expectation of that culture.
Wow. Yeah, so that's fascinating.
We don't get taught a lot unless you specifically go to an area that addresses, these particular things.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Anything else on the topic you wanted to add, Mick? Anything that we didn't cover that you think we should talk about for this subject?
No. Look, obviously, as I said, it's very similar to what was happening around the world, in that early 20s, post World War One.
Prohibition.
Lots of prohibition, lots of soldiers returning home. At that point in time, there was no, support or, what's the word? Like pension for soldiers. You just returned home and you had to go and find a job.
Right.
When there's no work and the depression's kicking in, you turn to whatever means you can to support your family.
Right. So there was prohibition in Australia at the same time as here?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. It was more to do with post 6 o'clock lockdown. So after a certain hour, you just simply couldn't buy alcohol.
Right.
And there's some talk about, or some information about, the reason that the New South Wales Parliament brought that in is there was something like 5,000 returned servicemen, who got into a massive brawl because they were all pissed. We call it pissed. You call it drunk.
Right.
Pissed, I think, pissed in America means you're cranky.
You're mad, right?
Yep. So we call it, if you're absolutely, rolling drunk, we call it being pissed.
Right.
So they were all, drunk as fools, in this massive fight.
Oh, shit.
So they've gone, nah, we need to do something about this, post 6 o'clock, and no one's allowed to get alcohol, which obviously then caused that, bootlegging, speakeasy type of situation.
Interesting. Well, we always love having you on, Mick. You're definitely an interesting character. Love the Australian accent. You're educating me on how to pick it out. Now I can, so I'm not that fool that thinks it sounds like a British accent.
We'll have to do some, I'll get the one day when everyone's around, we can get the other guys on as well, and we can do.
Oh, that'd be good.
And we can do a how to speak Australian 101.
That would be great. That'd be great. And we appreciate you taking time out of your Sunday to do this, and always appreciate talking to you, my friend. So thanks a lot. Horns up here from Murder Metal Mayhem, and thanks for doing this with me, man.
As always, thank you for letting me be a part of it.
Awesome.
Mother, man.